One of the things I've learned in studying conflict and following people who have been really stuck in toxic conflict and moved into healthy conflict, whether they're former gang leaders or politicians or activists or even guerrilla members in Colombia, there are some patterns. And one of the things that gets us into trouble often as humans in conflict is a false binary where there's an us and a them, and we sort large groups of people into these two categories. And for lots of evolutionary reasons and also some current cultural and economic reasons, when we do that, we tend to make a lot of mistakes about ourselves, the problem, or the other side, right? So that binary, Republican versus Democrat, black versus white, good versus evil, is almost always false.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is Ken Peternick, and today my guest is journalist Amanda Ripley. Amanda has spent much of her career studying and writing about conflict and polarization around the world. She's written for Time Magazine, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and many other publications. And her most recent book, the one that really grabbed my attention, is High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. Amanda, welcome to Courageous Conversations.
Thanks for having me, Ken. Good to be here.
Well, if you've listened to previous episodes of this podcast, you know that I typically have guests who represent opposing sides of controversial issues affecting schools, issues at the center of today's culture wars, like the one we had recently about whether teachers are indoctrinating students, as an increasing number of people and politicians have been arguing, or about critical race theory, or the one we had with the state senator from Kentucky who thinks teachers should stick to reading, writing, and mathematics and to stay away from current events and controversial issues. And for that conversation, we will have educators who think restricting the curriculum in that way undermines the very purpose of education. But what's different about these conversations is that I ask people to listen to one another, that they not shout, and that they be respectful and curious. My hope is that in some small way, we can help calm the culture wars that are wreaking havoc in our schools. Boardrooms have become battle zones. Dedicated educators are leaving the profession, like Willie Carver, a teacher I interviewed yesterday, who was chosen as Teacher of the Year in Kentucky a year ago and was honored at the White House with 49 other outstanding teachers, and just a few weeks ago decided to quit. He quit because he is an openly gay teacher and he could no longer tolerate the restrictions on what he was allowed to teach and the rising hostility towards him, his LGBTQ colleagues, and his students. Well, today I'm speaking with Amanda Ripley, not about any particular school controversy, but about the culture wars themselves, about conflict, whether there's a way out. So, Amanda, what do you make of the culture wars in education?
Well, it's funny because I used to cover education for Time Magazine and The Atlantic for years. And I feel like a lot of the conflict that is pervasive in education and politics and social media started first in education. If I look back at some of the conflicts that I covered, I would cover them very differently now, knowing what I do about conflict. But even, 10 years ago, it felt like in some of the education stories I was covering, there was an us versus them. The facts really, at a certain point, didn't matter as much as emotion and trust or distrust. And so in a lot of ways, I think education was my first exposure to intractable conflict. And it's obviously changed and gotten worse in some places. But it's the kind of thing we now see in other parts of life, right? But have seen in education in different ways for a long time.
In your book, you talk about, you have an interesting phrase, conflict entrepreneurs. And I wonder if you could just, for our listeners, explain what you mean by that and whether you have a sense of who they are when it comes to the culture wars in education?
Yeah, so the big takeaway for me, so I spent several years following people who understand conflict intimately, whether they are psychologists or researchers or gang violence interrupters or divorce lawyers. They all understand conflict differently than journalists and differently than most people. And the big lesson was that the problem isn't conflict. Conflict is how we get better, right? How we push each other, how we challenge each other and get challenged. The problem is what we might call high conflict, or it's sometimes called malignant conflict, which is the kind of conflict that takes on a life of its own. It becomes conflict for conflict's sake. It becomes all about winning. And you really lose sight of the original forces and values that led you into the fight. And in that kind of conflict, which I call high conflict, everyone ends up worse off to different degrees. So for me, the big lesson was to try to figure out, how do you stay out of high conflict and in what we might call good conflict or healthy conflict. And one of the tripwires, one of the sort of bombs that tends to lead to high conflict is conflict entrepreneurs. So looking across, I followed people who shifted out of high conflict, who got stuck in high conflict, and across all different contexts, from civil war in Colombia to political conflicts around the world, including in the US. There were often conflict entrepreneurs who were present, and conflict entrepreneurs are people or platforms who exploit conflict for their own ends, who sort of delight in the conflict. Sometimes that's for profit or power, but often, maybe even more often, I've found it's for a sense of importance, of attention, right? For a sense of belonging. Those kinds of maybe soft powers that are very, very magnetic, especially in a moment like this where we've really amplified the voices of conflict entrepreneurs and incentivized conflict entrepreneurship. So yeah, it's the kind of thing where once you see it, you can't unsee it. And conflict entrepreneurs are all around us. They're sometimes in your social media feed or on cable TV news. We can all be conflict entrepreneurs. So every day I wake up and, try not to be a conflict entrepreneur, because again, there are so many incentives for it right now. But to answer your question, I think in education, conflict entrepreneurs can take a bunch of different forms. The signature sign that you might be dealing with a conflict entrepreneur is repeated history of blame, right? There's always someone else at fault, a sort of quality where they're creating conflict wherever they go, where they tend to recruit deputy conflict entrepreneurs and seem pretty unhappy. It's not like they're enjoying it on some level, but they can't stop. So there's often, not always, but there's often a deeper psychological need that the conflict is meeting for them, right? So it could, in some cases, it could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a union representative, it could be a superintendent. I mean, it really can be anyone. But again, we've now designed a bunch of institutions to raise up and amplify the voices of conflict entrepreneurs. So they're a little maybe too loud and powerful right now.
And I want to ask you in a moment about how, if you feel that conflict entrepreneurs are affecting your school system, what sort of tools are available, strategies are available to, I'm sure the right word, resist or to deal with that. I'm thinking, I just read this morning, Amanda, in an article in USA Today about Moms for Liberty and the increasing power they have. On the surface, what they say is we're just simply trying to give more voice to parents. But in fact, most are Republicans and pretty conservative Republicans. They're showing up at school board meetings and demanding that, for instance, that books written by LGBTQ authors be removed, and anything that deals with racism that could be viewed as divisive, and they have a lot of power. And it seems to me that they may be a classic case of conflict entrepreneurs who are doing it for partisan purposes and not necessarily for the good of all kids in all schools.
Right, right. So in the book, in my book, High Conflict, my big advice for conflict entrepreneurs, based on everyone that I followed who shifted out of high conflict into good conflict, was to start by distancing yourself from conflict entrepreneurs. So let me give you an example. Gary Friedman was a sort of novice politician and conflict expert, world-renowned mediator who ran for office in his small town in Northern California. And as he put it to me, it took about 1/8 of a second before he got sucked into high conflict in politics, despite everything he knew about what not to do and what to do. Anyway, he lost 2 years of his peace of mind to what seemed like kind of small potatoes conflicts to an outsider in his town, and really lost his mind for a little while to the conflict, and then very purposefully shifted out of high conflict and created good conflict. And it was not easy to do, but he did do it. And the first thing he did was to distance himself from the conflict entrepreneur in his life, which in this case was a sort of veteran political operative who, as a favor, had been helping him with his campaign and quite, understandably applying the same rules that she used in national politics, including union politics, to this very small town race. But for him, he found it was much healthier to rely on his wife instead as his primary political advisor, because she really resisted any attempt to demonize his opponents, much more capable at resisting that than he was, actually. And she saw people as three-dimensional humans, and she pushed back and told him when he was being, when he was letting his ego dominate. And so that's an example of the value of distancing yourself from conflict entrepreneurs. And that is my number one piece of advice. But when the book came out, a lot of people wrote to me and said, okay, thanks, that's good advice, but what if you can't, right? What if you can't distance yourself from the conflict entrepreneurs in your midst? And I would suspect that's often the case in education, right? I mean, it's not so easy. It's not like, firing your lawyer, right? Like sometimes it's much harder. Sometimes they're your boss, the conflict entrepreneur. Sometimes they're your president, right? It's not so easy. So,
and just would say, Amanda, that what happens in schools is organized groups, often prodded, through social media or mainstream media or organizations like Moms for Liberty. They show up at school board meetings en masse and line up and yell at the school board, and to the point where the people that hold views that they don't like often quit. So what I hear from my colleagues is, how do we counter that? Now, if they were just simply to avoid them, they might say, well, let them do their thing at school board meetings. But I think they're feeling like perhaps we need to organize and show up in equal numbers to support the school board members that are volunteering their time in doing thoughtful work, and that our voice needs to be heard alongside of theirs. But I think there's also this sense that all that's going to do is contribute to the conflagration. It's just going to exacerbate things. So I'm just wondering, what's the way out of that kind of unhealthy conflict?
Look, this is tricky, right? But I will tell you one sure thing that I know, which is any intuitive thing you do in high conflict like this will almost certainly make things worse. So you have to do counterintuitive things and do them carefully. So in some cases, what does that look like? Well, it might start by asking yourself a very simple question, which is, what's my intuition telling me to do with this conflict entrepreneur? Consider what the answer is, and just consider, not saying you're going to do it, but just consider what it would look like to do the opposite, right? So let me give you an example. And going back to the story of the conflict entrepreneurs showing up at school boards that you mentioned. Your intuition, for a lot of people, their intuition with conflict entrepreneurs is to ignore them, just like hope they will go away, right? Which is very understandable. Most people are conflict avoidant, and it can be, an adaptive response in a lot of conflicts, but probably not in a high conflict where you're in this kind of dysfunctional negative feedback loop of hostile emotions, right? In that case, ignoring them, as probably a lot of your listeners know, doesn't work. They can sometimes metastasize when you do that. And if you can't distance yourself from them, then what? Well, you might want to try to call them out or shame them or, just hold them to account. Again, that is a very understandable impulse, right? I mean, it's not okay how some of these people are behaving. Typically, though, that is going to make things worse. So I ended up reporting this out because that's the one skill I have. And just talking to people who have dealt with a lot of conflict entrepreneurs, it's their job to do so. For example, Bill Eddy, who is a lawyer and mediator who specializes in dealing with high conflict people. He co-founded something called the High Conflict Institute, which I recommend people check out their website and books if you want more information on this. But he said, calling out a conflict entrepreneur is unwise. It doesn't motivate change. It typically escalates the conflict. And you again start to feel trapped, right? Well, if I can't call them out, I can't ignore them, and I can't distance myself from them, then what? So the first thing to do from all the reporting that I did, and none of this is easy, right, is to first of all just identify conflict entrepreneurs quickly. Don't call them out. Don't tell them you think they're a conflict entrepreneur, but notice who they are. And remember, right, this is important, that people can criticize and lead a union organizing drive and disagree profoundly without being a conflict entrepreneur. That's not what I'm talking about, right? The mark of a conflict entrepreneur is more about the way people engage in conflict over time, like a recurring pattern of dysfunction, perpetual blame, extreme behavior. They're quick to accuse, eager to validate every lament. They really seem to delight in the conflict, right? So once you've identified a possible conflict entrepreneur, now this is where it gets really hard. Resist the urge to demonize them to other people or even in your own mind, which is really hard, right? And the reason this doesn't work is because that kind of us versus them moral superiority thinking is the same kind of thinking that leads to high conflict. So you're not gonna get out of high conflict using the same the same tricks that got us in, right? The same traps. There's a good book I'd recommend to folks called Well-Intentioned Dragons, which is a book about managing conflict entrepreneurs in churches by Marshall Shelley, who puts it this way. He says, when attacked by a dragon, do not become one. So you want to avoid actually succumbing to the same behavior, which is really normal. Like if you just follow your intuition, you will start to act like a conflict entrepreneur if you're not careful.
I appreciate so much what you're saying about the impulses we have to resist. We have to stand up and fight, because how could you not? But I also really get, and I can think of personal experiences and things I've observed where, and you even sort of know it in the back of your mind, it's probably not going to make things better, but I still have to do it. But that's sort of an irrational response to it. Like, what do you ultimately want? I want this less conflict, or I want healthy conflict, but I'm choosing to go in and fight, knowing or having had experience that doing that is probably going to make things worse. But if you don't know what else to do, you think, well,
right,
at least I can say I fought.
Right. And I'm glad you said that, because it is true that it depends on what your goal is, right? Like, if your goal is to at least, make yourself or the people watching feel supported, feel like you've defended yourself, which are very worthy goals, right? That's one thing. I'm sort of talking about if you've decided you don't want to live in this particularly toxic culture anymore, but you still have to deal with these people, right? And if you want to do the counterintuitive thing, and you may not, or it may not be the right moment for it. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, right? If you do want to shift, even for your own sanity, which is the number one reason to do this, I think, if you want to shift out of high conflict or resist getting into high conflict with conflict entrepreneurs, after you've identified them, after you've resisted demonizing them, then here's the really tricky part. So your instinct is going to be to, like, as soon as you see them, turn around, walk the other way. In fact, again, the counterintuitive thing tends to be the much smarter move here, which is you literally have to spend more time with the conflict entrepreneur, not less. And again, this is going to depend on you, your boundaries, your strengths and weaknesses. Not everybody is up for this, but Gary, the conflict expert I told you about it, he told me, if they're 90% conflict entrepreneur, see if you can speak to the 10%. So listen to them and try to understand, ideally one-on-one, not with an audience if you can. Sometimes this is easier said than done. And you don't need to listen to them forever, right? Just long enough to make a connection. And that, a lot of conflict entrepreneurs have unresolved trauma in their background. They may not always be a conflict entrepreneur, but just know they probably have a lot of opinions that you profoundly disagree with. But the thing that most people want more than anything else that they very rarely get is to be heard, right? So can you give them that? Not agreeing with them, not changing your mind, not giving them what they want, but literally asking them questions with curiosity. And then I call it looping. There's different techniques for this, but really trying to distill what they said into the most elegant language you can muster, play it back for them, and check if you got it right. Like, you're truly trying to understand this person. There are different questions you can ask to do this, but the point is, see if you can give them this one thing, which actually costs you very little, right? In most cases, like to listen to them with curiosity. And then once you've done that, typically, not always, again, without an audience, that will lower the person's guard a little bit because they want to be heard. There's research by Graham Bodie, who studies listening, that most people feel heard about 11% of the time. So people very rarely feel heard. And I know there are really annoying rules about this with a lot of school boards. I don't know what the rules are in California, but in a lot of school boards and other places, there's a lot of rules around how you can talk to the public and how the public can talk to you if you're a school board elected official. And this is usually done with good intentions, but can often have the effect of making it very difficult to de-escalate the conflict. But putting that aside, if there's a way to listen to them, figure out what is the 10% that's not conflict entrepreneur, because everybody is more than one thing. Everybody has multiple identities, multiple things they care about. And then see, and this is hard, see if you can redirect some of that energy, right? In companies or schools, it might mean channeling the energy of a conflict entrepreneur toward something productive that you both care about. Usually it's kids, right? I mean, in this context. Again, easier said than done, right? But you want to give them a choice rather than a mandate. You want to really try to connect on the thing that's the 10% non-conflict entrepreneur and try to connect with them as a human so that you at least rehumanize yourself, because it's harder for them to dehumanize you when you start acting like a human. It just creates more friction internally for them.
I'm thinking of a book I read recently. You're probably familiar with it, called Conversations with People Who Hate Me by Dylan Marin. Yeah. And he was a podcaster who delighted and had lots of listeners, and he delighted in sort of criticizing people on the right, but he got hate mail a little bit from, and he's gay and open about it, and he sort of put it in his hate mail folder. And then he finally realized that it wasn't all that satisfying to speak to people that already agreed with him. He decided to dive into that folder of hate mail, and he contacted people who essentially hated him because they were on social media, just were hoping for terrible things to happen to him, wanted him to die and in terrible ways. So he would contact them, and not all of them wanted to talk with him, but those who did, and he said, I just want to talk with you and find out why you wrote what you did. And I'm curious because I don't have that many people in my life that hate me, but clearly you do. And invariably people would say, well, I don't really hate you. And in fact, as they were heard, as you said, a lot of them would come around and say, I'm sorry for having written it, but you have to understand, I'm in some cases, I'm the victim of a lot of bullying myself, and I get frustrated, and then I have these religious beliefs, and when you talk about your lifestyle and it doesn't jive with what I think is, I just get frustrated. But these conversations led to a place where, in some cases, he became friends with these people, and they would meet and have coffee later. So I think that's terribly counterintuitive. It didn't strike him that
Totally.
he should do this. And it's the last thing he would do. But then it's just an illustration of what you're talking about, that the counterintuitive thing can actually lead to something unexpected and good.
Yeah, I think I haven't read the book, but didn't he actually put those conversations in his podcast?
Yeah, he
Because I
did.
remember listening.
Hi, is this Josh?
Yeah, it's Josh.
So, back in January, you wrote, "You are the most pathetic human being I have ever seen on the internet in my entire life." Josh, what inspired you to write that message? Hi, I'm Dylan Marin, and I'm starting a new podcast called Conversations with People Who Hate Me.
It is
It's
really
an
interesting to
interview
listen
series
to
where
their
I get to-
voices, right, and really hear that that exchange. And look, in some cases, it's dangerous to put yourself in that kind of conversation, particularly in person. But what I found is it often feels more dangerous than it actually is, and sometimes it's more dangerous to not have conversations like this.
What sparked you to send that initial message?
I was just angry about it all.
I'd actually messaged a few different popular people on Facebook, but you're actually the only one that messaged back.
I was very outraged by the views he had, especially on abortion.
I had a couple cocktails in me, but let me tell you, I stand by most of what I said.
Did you think that I would read the message?
Amanda, I asked Willie Carver, the teacher I mentioned earlier, who just quit, Teacher of the Year in Kentucky, to consider a counterintuitive strategy like reaching out and talking with the people in his school district who have caused him so much grief. And he said, I don't think that would work. He said they're dealing with fear, and the fear is being stoked by leaders like Governor DeSantis and many others who say that people like me are indoctrinating your kids, we're grooming your kids, and some of us are molesting or would want to molest your kids. And I can't counter those messages. We have to somehow figure out a way not to have our national leaders and other leaders stoke this fear among the people whose children I teach.
He may not be the person, right, to have those conversations, and this may not be the time. But to his point, which is so critical, right, is how do we shift this whole dynamic so that conflict entrepreneurs are not incentivized and glorified on social media, in the news, in politics? That is what we need to do in the longer term, right? So that, because the best defense against a conflict entrepreneur is a culture of good conflict, where questions get asked, honest disagreement is encouraged, and people behave with like a baseline level of decency. Then conflict entrepreneurs don't thrive, right, the way they do now. So there are different ways to do this, right? And I think you probably have to do all of them. You have to do them at the grassroots level. You have to do them at the national level. You have to do them from the top down, from the bottom up. Shift those norms. I mean, you could design a new version of Twitter and YouTube today that would raise up and amplify the voices of conflict interrupters as opposed to conflict entrepreneurs. That's not a hard problem. But right now, there's a lot of profit being made, right, by conflict entrepreneurs. So it's not hard to imagine, right? And we even know, like, there are platforms right now where conflict entrepreneurs are not welcome, right? I mean, I'm thinking about LinkedIn is not perfect at all, but on average, less toxic, right? There's just a different set of norms. But I think one thing I think about a lot is, no one likes to feel like they're being played. No one likes to be manipulated. And how do we expose conflict entrepreneurs as the manipulators they are? Because no one red, blue, in the middle. No one likes to be played. And it reminds me, I think, a lot about and the research on how to convince people to stop smoking, right, back in the day. One of the tactics that worked best was this public service ad that made this point. So it depicted, big tobacco executives up in their, skyscraper office, and they were looking down on a bunch of young people who were piling up body bags, as a sort of symbol for all the people who've died from tobacco use. And the whole point of the ad was, you got to stop being manipulated by these guys that are making money off you. And teenagers in particular do not like to be played that way, right? But adults don't either. And there was like a really great study of this, which you may know about, but it was really brilliantly done, where they could see where the ad aired and where it didn't. And they could see this real drop off in tobacco use, especially among young people, after that ad aired. And now there's been another study doing the same thing with nutrition, looking at like how junk food companies manipulate kids. And people, you can shift how you see conflict entrepreneurs once you see how you're being toyed with on purpose. So one challenge, I think, for all of us is, how do we get there? How do we help everyone start to see conflict entrepreneurs for who they are, which is, damaged people who need help and may not be getting it.
And the counterintuitive one strategy is to reach out and talk with them and listen to them and be curious, and maybe beginning to do that in settings that don't where they don't feel like they have to play to the crowd. And school board meetings are not that place.
No, and it's very tricky. That's a very tricky, because of all these artificial constraints, right, on how the meeting can be run and who can talk to whom and for how long. So it's a real trap, I think, that, I think it would be interesting to talk about. I'd love to hear about districts that have changed rules around that. Is there a way if you were to design the rules around school board or any kind of public meeting for good conflict, what would that look like? Is there another way to do this that still preserves public integrity and transparency, right? But allows for people to feel heard without dominating the discussion. And I don't think it's the hardest problem humans have ever worked on, right? But that's something I'd love to write about if anyone knows of a place where that's happened, because I think you could design these things to be more conducive to good conflict. And, in the meantime, I think it's very important to recognize conflict entrepreneurs, to, if you can't distance yourself from them, to really try to make them feel heard without an audience, if possible, and to try to speak to the 10% and create a culture of good conflict in the longer term.
Amanda, one other quick thing before we bring this to a close. I have to think that maybe the contact theory that you write about really would apply, especially in schools where they don't yet have conflict, but they're worried about it coming. And efforts that schools could make to solidify relationships with parents and to create such a strong sense of community that if conflict entrepreneurs tried to penetrate it and break it up, people would say, you can't do this. We love our teachers. And so just say a word about
I love that question, because now is the time to act, right?
Yeah.
If you don't yet have high conflict, if you've not yet been captured as a school district by high conflict, or a family or a church or whatever the case, now is the time to build good conflict, right? And that's what, I spend a lot of my time doing, is working with organizations to train them to develop those guardrails. But with regards to contact theory, right? So this is really the only rigorously proven way to reduce demonization and prejudice is contact theory, which is by bringing people together with certain conditions, which are important, that creates a kind of transcendent identity that's bigger than the us and them. It sort of expands the us And when you do this right, what you find is people are just much less likely to assume the worst of each other. So yes, to your point, you have like more resilience built into the culture so that when things go wrong, as they always do, right, in any complicated system, and especially schools, people give you the benefit of the doubt before assuming the worst, because there's some human connection there. So the conditions that are important very quickly, been 500 experiments done on contact theory all over the world, so luckily we know a lot about it. But one thing that's important is to, when you bring people together, make sure they're on equal footing in the room, if not in the world at large. So this is why it's important to not necessarily have a student and a superintendent, right? Like you can, but you're going to have to do some work to make sure they have equal footing and status in the room. And then another thing that's important is to have a common problem that they're trying to solve, right? So an example of this when it comes to, maybe an analogy is there's a woman named Megan Hunter who has done a lot of work with high conflict companies. And in one case, which, this large family owned business was on the verge of bankruptcy because of all the internal conflict, she asked the feuding family members to work together to create a mission statement, which for some reason they had never done. Such a simple thing, right? But the effect blew her away. She said it was the first time they'd all been in the same room without F-bombs being hurled and someone storming out. And they were so proud of that mission statement, So it's not enough, right? But some kind of common problem that you're working on. Sometimes it can be building a new playground, right? I mean, it depends on the situation, but a legitimate problem that you're both working on. And then some kind of respected third party that has endorsed the whole gathering, right? Whether that's a faith leader or a local, company, I don't know, it depends on the situation. But those things can help those kinds of contact experiences go better. And then again, as you know, they have to continue. It can't just be a one-off thing, right? Where we all play basketball and then we never see each other again.
I interviewed for another podcast I have called Teacher Stories, a teacher in a pretty conservative area in the San Francisco Bay Area about, she's a social studies teacher, and she says she continues to teach history accurately and honestly. And she says that, and her principal was on the call with us and said, I completely support her. We live in a conservative community. I never get any complaints. And they both attributed it to the fact that she has really good relationships with her parents. She's communicates with them frequently about what she's doing. She invites them to respond to the curriculum and to meet with her. And it's a form of contact theory. And
right.
so when
she's got a relationship. Yeah,
she does. She builds relationships with parents rather than saying, look, I'm the teacher. I'm going to teach the curriculum. And if you have any complaints, I'm sorry, this is what I do. But she doesn't have that approach at all. And the principal's there supporting her, but they both attributed it to the fact that she has these strong relationships year after year with parents.
It's so often it's amazing how often it comes down to relationship, right? I mean, if you look at the research on great teaching, it's often about the relationship the teacher has with the student and vice versa. If you look at policing, it's about relationship, and it's very hard to scale, right? It's hard to have a relationship with NBC News, right? Like that's a big challenge for the news media at the national level. But when you can have a real relationship, they say you need a ratio of 5 to 1, roughly, in the conflict research. 5 positive encounters for every 1 negative in order to keep conflict healthy. So, if I were a teacher looking ahead for the fall, I would be trying to build up that side of the ledger. Like, how can we create those positive encounters with parents, with students, with elected officials? And your story reminds me of the other day I had dinner with an elected state board of education that was half Republican, half Democrat, and they get along really well. They disagree on many, many things. But I asked them, same question you asked, right? How are you doing this? And they said, well, it helps that we have dinner together before we meet.
Yeah.
So, sometimes these things sound so obvious, but we don't do them, especially, during the pandemic. It was very hard to do these things that boost your magic ratio, but it's so important to build that relationship so that you can depend on it when you need it.
Yeah. Well, Amanda, I want to thank you so much for being part of Courageous Conversations about our schools. I've learned a lot. You piqued my curiosity and really given me some things to think about in terms of how not only you can respond to conflict and the importance of pausing, as you suggested, and thinking of exactly the opposite of what your intuition tells you to do, and just to see what would that look like, and might it be worth trying. So I'm hoping that our listeners found that advice useful as well. So thanks so much for being part of this.
Likewise, I learned a lot. So thank you for the work that you do, and thanks for having me on.
Thanks for sharing your insights into today's culture wars and for offering some hope that we might just be able to move away from high conflict towards healthy conflict. And if we can pull that off, there's no doubt in my mind that it will benefit our schools, our students, and ultimately our country. And thanks, listeners, for tuning in. And by the way, you'll find all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations about our schools at schoolconversations.org and on most podcasting platforms. Bye, everyone.